from around 1876 to the closure of the last residential school in 1996. It was a project of the Canadian government right from the beginning, but the schools themselves were mainly run by the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, and the Presbyterian and United Churches. The majority of the schools, though, were run by the Catholic Church, and the majority of those were run by the Missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate. I think a good point of comparison to understand the environments within these schools would be maybe the industrial schools of Ireland and the Magdalen laundries. If you know, I've been sort of delving into that history a little bit as well, and there's a lot of similarities there. Although here there was a crucial added feature, which, you know, the intent with the residential schools was really to have for these children to have their native culture sort of wrung out of them as part of this larger colonial project. So stories about the residential schools and what had happened there and the damage that had been done really started sort of entering the national consciousness in Canada in the early 1990s. That was really just as that, you know, the whole residential school project had really reached its end. In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada released a huge final report on their investigation into the residential schools. And like Deborah said, the report argues that the system was part of a larger government initiative that amounted to an attempt at cultural genocide, and that its goal was the sort of eradication of Indigenous culture. Now, at the time, I was, you know, when in 2015, I was kind of taken aback by this term. You know, I thought it was too inflammatory. I thought it would invite comparisons to systemic mass killing, like you see in like the Holocaust. And I didn't think that kind of comparison was helpful. But now I've come to see it, though, as a legitimate term, you know, given that mass killing is really only one of the tools used in genocide. So alongside other tools like family separation, mental or physical degradation, and even, you know, sterilization, which did sadly happen to like far too many Indigenous people over the course of Canadian history. The term cultural genocide has actually been used more recently by some commentators to describe China's treatment of the Muslim Uyghur population. There with the Uyghurs, it's a similar thing in that we're not dealing with the destruction of a culture through mass killing like we saw in World War II, but instead it's through a systematic government-run program of family separation and re-education. The idea is to, you know, again, destroy the inherited culture of these people and make them into good, you know, Chinese citizens, right? So the purpose of like I've been saying, the purpose of the residential school since right from the very beginning, it was explicit, you know, and apparent to all that it was, as it is sometimes put, to kill the Indian in the child. That was the idea, or simply to stop the transmission of Indigenous culture and identity. And the idea was that children would be separated from their families at a young age, apart from, you know, summers spent at home, and turned into civilized Christian Canadians. The regimes at the residential schools were extremely rigid, with many people report like an almost total lack of love and tenderness, which children, you know, desperately need, and just a focus on punishment, psychological punishment, corporal punishment. The students were often referred to by number instead of name, and would be punished for speaking their native languages. religious discipline was a big part of it, and it was very harsh. And it primarily took form as took hold as a form of trauma for these children. In terms of funding, the schools were very underfunded compared to schools for non-Indigenous children, and an almost universal experience was a chronic malnourishment and hunger that is still a source of collective trauma among Indigenous people. The students were often forced to work, work half days. It was kind of under this euphemism of vocational training, but they'd help maintain the school and grow food and things like that. And then, of course, when disease hit, as it often did, especially in the earlier days of the residential schools, the death rate was very high. And then amidst all of that, there was unfortunately a widespread culture of sexual and physical abuse that left a real legacy of shame that a lot of people are still working to get over. So I think, even if one takes a sort of ends justifies the means approach to understanding the residential schools, and I've seen at least one popular Catholic publication take this position, which I found awful, but in the sense that these children, whatever they suffered, at least had the chance to escape, what was considered like paganism. I think they have to still be considered a failure because, while some students did, it's true that some students did benefit from them and they went on to, assimilate into Canadian society. Really, on the whole, they left generations of Indigenous people broken, mentally broken, spiritually lost and angry at the church and the Canadian government. And I think the cultural wreckage is still sadly very visible in Canada. That being said, a lot of Indigenous people in Canada have actually held on to their Christianity, and many of them consider themselves Roman Catholics, although it's a very, I think, fraught and difficult relationship. So that's the basic history. Now we turn to the history of the sort of, how we've dealt with it over time. So since the early 1990s, the Anglican Church of Canada, the Presbyterian Church in Canada, and the United Church have all issued formal official apologies for the treatment of students in the schools for which they were responsible. In 2008, Prime Minister Stephen Harper offered an official apology on behalf of the Canadian government. On the Catholic side, the Missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate did offer an extensive apology in 1991, very early on. But there's been no official apology from the Catholic Church as a whole. In 2009, though, a delegation that was led by the Grand Chief of the Assembly of First Nations of Canada visited Pope Benedict, and he, in that meeting, and this is a quote, expressed his sorrow at the anguish caused by the deplorable conduct of some members of the church in the residential schools. So it should be said, though, that with this apology, I mean, this was good, but there was no admission of any sort of systemic injustice, but it was more of an apology for the kind of the few bad apples who may have done terrible things. So that's where things stood until 2015, which is when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission published their report. And I really do recommend having a look at it if you can. There's an executive summary, which is extremely long in itself, but it's actually not too dense a read. It's well put together. Along with the report that they published, they also published 94 calls to action that were directed at furthering justice and reconciliation. in the wake of the residential schools and the revelations about them. And the one that's most pertinent to Catholics is Call to Action 58, and that's the one that says, "We call upon the Pope to issue an apology to survivors, their families, and communities for the Roman Catholic Church's role in the spiritual, cultural, emotional, physical, and sexual abuse of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children in Catholic-run residential schools. We call for that apology to be similar to the 2010 apology issued to Irish victims of abuse, and to occur within 1 year of the issuing of this report, and to be delivered by the Pope in Canada." So that was the call to action number 58. The 2010 apology that they refer to here is the one that was issued by Pope Benedict in his pastoral letter of March 19th, 2010. This was after the publication of the final report of the Irish government's commission to inquire into child abuse in May 2009, and that dealt largely with the legacy of Ireland's church-run residential schools. So again, we see there is this connection between the residential schools and the industrial schools in Ireland. Now, some in the church at the time in 2015 pushed back against the idea of Pope Francis offering an apology. At the time I agreed with them, and they would often point to apologies that had already been given by the Oblates or by Pope Benedict. Said like, that's enough, that's all we need to do. But it really became clear that it wasn't going to be enough to actually further reconciliation. So in 2017, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau visited Pope Francis and had a private meeting with him. And during that meeting, he told the Pope that he thought a papal apology for the Catholic Church's role in the residential school system would help with the process of healing and reconciliation. And he invited the Pope to Canada to deliver the apology. Then about a little less than a year later, there was some hope, I think, in the air that Pope Francis would respond positively to this, but the Canadians experienced Canadians who are hoping for furthering reconciliation experienced some disappointment when the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops published a letter saying that, quote, "The Holy Father is aware of the findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which he takes seriously. As far as Call to Action 58 is concerned, after carefully considering the request and extensive dialogue with the bishops of Canada, he felt that he could not personally respond." So, and there's a little, stuff about that he encouraged reconciliation and healing, and but he was not actually going to provide a personal response or apology. And again, at the time, I was feeling, maybe a little on the fence about it. Like at first I was thinking, I don't think Pope Francis needs to apologize. Then I started thinking, okay, maybe this is not the right move. In reaction to that, a motion was introduced in Canada's House of Commons to basically go over the head of the CCCB and invite Pope Francis to Canada to issue an apology. And the CCCB tried to sort of forestall that motion, and they issued what I thought was a very defensive statement as a means of sort of pushing back against this. In their statement, they tried to explain the context of the residential schools. They said that the church in Canada has a very decentralized structure. They said that, this is a quote, "Each diocese and institute or religious order is corporately and legally responsible for its own actions. The Catholic Church as a whole in Canada was not associated with the residential schools, nor was the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops." And to me, this came across as a classic example of, the church engaging in what really seemed like a decentralization of responsibility. So, I mean, although, we know the Catholic Church is one of the most centralized institutions anywhere, and has been for a very long time, when something like this comes up, the question of who's responsible for what happened in the residential school, suddenly people are saying, oh, it's all very decentralized. It's all very, we can't be responsible for what this diocese does or what this religious order does. And then you kind of bury the question in this kind of complicated world of bureaucracy. And that to me seemed very much a tactic to avoid responsibility. I mean, in the end, it was unsuccessful, and it didn't stop the motion from passing to invite the Pope to Canada. So that was where things stood a year ago when I wrote my Where Peter Is piece. And in that piece, I also expressed my opinion. And this was, for me, because I was writing, I'm a huge Pope Francis fan. I was writing for this blog, Where Peter Is, that is all about defending Pope Francis. And it was kind of a big thing for me to say, I think Pope Francis should reconsider his decision to avoid giving a personal response, and that he should really consider, making an official apology on behalf of the church. So at the time, it seemed unlikely to happen. And at the time, I felt like, oh, maybe I'm a bit out of line, kind of, calling for this. But it is how I felt after really beginning to understand the significance of the residential school legacy. So shortly after that, I published that piece last year at the end of February, and then at the end of May, news hit that about the probable remains of 215 children that had been located through ground penetrating radar technology on the site of what used to be the Kamloops Indian residential school. And that made international news and changed the narrative substantially. I do think that when this hit the news, things did get a bit twisted. The media sometimes used the term mass graves to describe the findings. And that gave people the unfortunate impression that, these graves were evidence of like some kind of mass killings, kind of like, again, a sort of Holocaust type comparison. There's no evidence of that. But the truth of it, and they did find more graves at other sites, and it's going on. I think we're going to find many, many more over the next few years. The truth is, that these are the forgotten graves of forgotten children, right? That these are I like to think of these as sort of like the footprints of a larger machine of cultural destruction. So we're not dealing with like crime scenes of the usual sort, like murder scenes, but it's evidence of true systemic injustice that lasted, for a very long time. And these children were sort of the casualties of the colonial processes that we'd all like to forget, since they helped to, create the Canada that we benefit from. So that's sort of my take on it, as a bit of a pushback against the idea that this sort of mass graves idea. I don't think that's quite accurate, and it can lead to some comparisons that end up not being helpful. But it's still the discovery of these graves is still evidence of something that was a systemic injustice that we need to reckon with. So the revelations about the graves, led to what might be called a summer of shame, I guess, in Canada, that very sadly also included a number of church burnings and desecrations. I don't think I'm exaggerating in saying that the mood in Canada regarding the Catholic Church was then probably, the worst it's ever been, at least, in my memory. Some of the criticisms of the church, I think, were very fair. Some of them were unfair. There was, like a lot of people very angry at the church, making all sorts of accusations. But I do think that the frustration and the disappointment in most case is real, and it's not an excuse to attack the church. I mean, Indigenous rights are a huge issue in Canada. You know, our treatment of Indigenous people is generally recognized as I guess, a great, national sin, you might say, or at least that question is a big part of our national discourse. So emotions run very deep on the issue. But so the whole response to that was a bit complicated, but it generally was an expression of anger, unbelief, and a call for real justice. So all of that criticism did manage to set the church in Canada into motion again on the issue. The CCCB responded in June, not by calling for an official apology, but by organizing a delegation of Indigenous people to travel to the Vatican to meet with the Pope. The criticism of the church continued, especially for what was seen as their kind of slow walking the financial response to that had been agreed upon earlier regarding residential schools. And finally, at the end of September of last year, the CCCB issued an official apology for the residential school. So on behalf of the church in Canada, anyway. Then October 27th, there was a huge development when the CCCB announced they had invited Pope Francis to Canada and that he had accepted their invitation. So the plans are going to be discussed with the Indigenous delegation that's heading to the Vatican, I believe next month. Whether or not Pope Francis will offer an official apology when he comes to Canada, I don't know, but it's still all very significant. So, looking back on all this, I mean, it's funny because when I wrote that piece, I thought the issue of residential schools in the Catholic Church, it was kind of a dead issue. I thought, like, there's not going to be any movement on this. And then all of a sudden, everything changed in the course of a very short time. Looking back on it all, I'm absolutely thrilled that Pope Francis plans to come to Canada. And I think that, whatever happens, that reconciliation between the church and Indigenous peoples will take, I think, a huge step forward. On the other hand, I'm saddened by how long it took to reach this point. I think, and how much resistance the church offered until finally giving in. We saw some kind of classic tactics, sort of like slow walking a response to crisis and only giving in when there was, enough pressure. And then, sometimes appealing to this very counterintuitive idea of a very decentralized church in order to sort of decentralize responsibility, or the, kind of few bad apples sort of apologies. Instead of, I think what people have been wanting is genuine confession and contrition, without sort of qualifications and evasions. So I think, this whole thing shows that, real change can happen in the church, but also that it often takes a long time, and it involves a sometimes very grueling process. I know there are some comments. I'm going to have to look at those in a minute. Just as a quick addendum, though, I do want to address something that has really disturbed me in the response to the residential schools issue lately, and that's some recent examples of what I would call denialism being published and shared, and I've seen this in shared by some sort of prominent Catholics, and this is especially in response to the Kamloops findings with the graves. So just to kind of briefly look over what denialism is all about. This goes back to what we've seen regarding the Holocaust. After the Holocaust in the 50s, and this is something I've studied in my work on conspiracy theory. There were a lot of autobiographical books published by concentration camp survivors, and some of the early studies of the Holocaust. And almost immediately you get deniers emerging, people who tried to kind of explain all this away, or and they used, techniques that were then used, for decades and are still used to cast doubt on the Holocaust, and are used in other contexts as well. So, first of all, the deniers would question the testimony of the survivors relentlessly. Like, they'd start from a position of suspicion, assuming that the survivors had an agenda or couldn't be trusted to be objective, right? And they'd focus on, little inconsistencies that you always get when large numbers of people are recounting, horribly traumatic events. They'd ask for forensic information or evidence, that was, either impossible to provide, since so much evidence had been destroyed, or it couldn't quickly and easily be provided. They'd ask, where are the bodies? Show me the proof. Are we just, are we supposed to accept this without hard forensic evidence? And of course, for one, nobody's inclined to gather proof for people who are making these demands in bad faith, and they won't accept the proof anyway. And then they'd also relativize the tragedy by comparing it to, trauma and suffering of other groups during wartime, and play games with statistics, arguing that like the 6 million number should be revised down to almost nothing, kind of, so it's the same stuff over and over again. And it really distressed me to see, and I won't mention the publications or the authors involved, but to see those same techniques being used again. And then to see some Catholics, accepting this denialism uncritically and enthusiastically when it came to the residential schools. So I've seen articles, again, this is more recently, questioning, the testimony of survivors, accusing them of mass hysteria or false memory syndrome, ridiculing the idea that traditional knowledge can be a guide for understanding, what happened in the past. They'll say, not one body has been found, which is true in a very narrow and literal sense, in that there have been no like forensic exhumations of the bodies that have been discovered, but it's very misleading. So like in Kamloops, the anthropologist who conducted the search, Dr. Sarah Beaulieu, she found it was around 200 probable graves, revised down from an original estimate of 215. Now, she's an expert in ground penetrating radar, trained on a Canadian military base. She's used her skills to help locate regular municipal cemeteries. She even helped discover in a former World War I internment camp, a tunnel that had been used by prisoners to escape. That was an internment camp in BC. She gave a press conference in July of last year, where she went through her whole process in how she located these grave sites. The area that she searched was chosen because, residential school survivors identified it as a place they remembered seeing graves being dug, and because a juvenile rib bone had been found there at one time. She provided very compelling scans showing the anomalies typically associated with grave sites, and then distinguishing these from tree root patterns and other possible anomalies. She noted depressions in the soil over the suspected graves, as well as like east-west orientation of the graves, which suggested Christian burial. And it's extremely compelling evidence, but, like a good scientist, she also said that the only way we can have sure confirmation is through forensic exhumations. So I don't know if exhumations are planned. This is on Indigenous land, and they may not want to go through the trauma of digging up these bodies. And then at the same time, it's not just a process where you kind of grab some shovels and dig up graves. It's, it often involves a lot of very detailed, careful forensic work. So the denialists have taken this and said that, they've portrayed this woman who discovered the graves in Kamloops as a, an amateur. She used unreliable technology. She found anomalies that could be anything. And they note that, she herself couldn't confirm that there were graves. But again, she was being a scientist. She was saying there's no, with any kind of ground penetrating radar, the only way you can be absolutely sure is by doing an exhumation. That's just scientific prudence, but they take it as, a sign that she doesn't really know what she's doing. And so they come to the conclusion that no bodies have actually been found. It's all just a myth that was used to, launch a sort of attack on the church. So again, I think, we're seeing how with change in the church, and a real reckoning with past injustice, we also get some very ugly pushback at times. And I think it's always like this in the church, with issues ranging from the abuse crisis to more recent pushes for the church to combat, racism, or be more open to LGBT people, or to incorporate more women in positions of authority, that sort of thing. You always get this pushback, and I was once someone who pushed back, and eventually I changed. And I like to think that, when things get ugly like that, that's when there might actually be real change just around the corner. And I think, the history of our reckoning as, the church with the legacy of the residential schools shows that this is possible. This change can really happen. So that's all I have to say. And sorry for rambling on so long.
No. That's great.
But I'm happy to
take
talk
some questions
about,
and have some discussion. Yeah. So folks, our system is, so if you have a question, if you could use that little button at the bottom that, you raise your hand, that's the reaction button at the bottom of your screen. Or if you have a comment, especially if you're from Canada, we'd really love to hear also from you. We know this problem is just beginning to show up in other places in the United States. So we know that these things are, and we have our own history with so much of this kind of injustice. So I would very much, and David, I don't know if you want to look at the chat box, if there's anything that is there for you. But I guess, just to start off, my own question is, why do you think it takes so long? I kind of get the other actors in this, but why does it take so long for the Catholic Church, who taught me that, once you recognize you did something wrong, say you're sorry, do your penance. Why does it take so long for the leadership and even the Pope to do the same? What's at odds with just saying, geez, are you kidding? Is this what we did? In the name of the Catholic Church? Yes, we're sorry. Why do you think that happens?
I think it goes back to this idea that if we admit that the church could have made mistakes, that the church could have been involved in things that, really actively harmed people, then that would sort of undermine the church's claims to authority. That's to me is one of the big issues. So the church is sometimes, it'll first of all, it'll apologize for the kind of few bad apples, right? It'll be, oh, we had some bad people here. It's like with the abuse crisis, right? There's some bad people. It's not the church's fault in general. Like, it's not a systemic problem. It's just, we got to be better at keeping the bad people out. And over time, it takes a while for the church to admit there may actually be systemic issues here, and things that we kind of took for granted as being good may have actually had very harmful effects. And so we have to come to terms with that, I think. I see it. I'm a big fan of Pope Benedict. I think, I came into the church, well, not came into the church, I reverted under Pope Benedict back in the 2000s. But, I saw that same dynamic in his, recent apology for what had happened in the Munich archdiocese in Germany and his involvement. And it was this incredibly nuanced apology that just, again, it still felt like there was like not this sort of unconditional, I did something wrong or I was involved in something wrong. It was always this kind of like very, very nuanced, like, let's see how far we can go without actually saying that, you know, that I'm guilty of something, right? Like that's, and it's, I find that very frustrating, and I see it all the time. And I do think it is part of this idea that, you know, we don't want to admit that, you know, maybe the church gets it wrong sometimes, right? Like we kind of think that, you know, the church is always right, that if we all just kind of follow church teaching, everything will work out great for everyone. But it doesn't always quite work that way. Sometimes we need to come to terms with some of the mistakes that the church has made.
Very good, thank you. Catherine, you have a question?
Yes, I'm wondering if some of the hesitancy in fully apologizing has to do with this very human term called infallibility, which only came about in, you know, within 200 years ago, I think. So could you comment on that?
With the okay, so the idea of infallibility, I mean, it's a huge question, and I think because the concept of infallibility, no matter what we might like to think, it's actually fairly loosely defined in some ways, and it's not always clear where it applies. Some people tend to expand it so that you know, almost like every decision of the church is infallible, and then some people shrink it so that it's, you know, only in like very, very specific situations is the church speaking infallibly, or the Pope speaking infallibly. But yeah, it's a big issue. I mean, I think, you know, Hans Kung was one of the people who, I don't agree with all of his conclusions, but at the same time, I take to heart some of his critique of the problem of infallibility, that it has created a sort of prison, you know, for the church, where we can't question the past, we can't question things that have been received by tradition, because to do that would be in some way to undermine infallibility. Although we've seen that it can happen, like with Vatican II and the big changes on, you know, the church's attitude towards the Jews, or towards, you know, religious freedom and conscience. Like these things, these changes happen. So we've got to, again, it's these are really interesting gray areas that we're still working through, I think, and that's why there's so many strong opinions about them.
Thank you, Catherine. Marie, you have a question. You'll have to unmute, Marie.
Oh, yeah, you're muted.
Yeah.
Sorry. In scripture, it says, you know, what is hidden in darkness will be revealed in the light. And a lot of these situations, you know, it has happened that way. Do you feel that the situation with what happened with the Indigenous peoples and other areas of like the abuse in the church is related to the problem of clericalism, where they become so full of themselves, and then on a power trip, you know, I am, you know, the priest or the Monsignor or whatever, you know, and not smelling like the sheep, let's say, like Pope Francis recommends.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that for sure. I mean, you know, reading about the residential schools and the general atmosphere, it really feels like a lot of these people who were involved, you know, from the, you know, the institutional church, really had no way of relating to children, or like showing, you know, real loving, kind relationships that, you know, it was like there was a sort of deep emotional immaturity there. And I think we see that in the abuse crisis as well. Mm-hmm. And it's when you have, I think, people who are sort of, the idea is instilled in them that they're sort of above and beyond kind of ordinary lay people and they exist in a, a world all their own. Yeah, I think huge issues can follow from that. And yeah, I mean, I shouldn't, I really don't want to generalize though, like as I say that. I know that there were people who were involved in the residential schools who were, priests and other religious who were, very kind and loved these kids. And but I'm talking about general trends, and that seems to have been the general trend. And again, a focus on punishment as the sort of driving factor in raising children or train, or bringing people into the faith and into religious discipline, as opposed to starting with love. And I think too, tied into clericalism is this idea that Catholic culture is the only culture that that anyone needs, and that there's no way to bring in, like, say, like aspects of Indigenous culture and have them work in harmony with the church. I think there are ways to do that, but I think that a lot of the people at the time just couldn't understand how that could even be possible. And again, it wasn't something that the government wanted either. They didn't want to sort of bring Indigenous culture along into Canadian culture. They wanted to get rid of Indigenous culture entirely so that you'd have civilized Christian Canadians. Yeah.
Well, hopefully we would have been better as a church and not go along with the government.
Yeah, I think that shows, I think as the church has to be, very, very careful in getting involved in these sort of state-run projects, and also be aware of the currents that are going on. Like, don't uncritically accept colonialism as kind of just the way things are. The church could have been a force in some ways. I don't want to generalize, because in some ways the church did push back, but the church could have been a force truly working against some colonialism and some of the abuses that were going on. But unfortunately, too often it just went with the flow of things.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Oh, thanks.
Thanks,
You're welcome.
Marie. So we have Lillian. You have a question. And if you'll unmute, Lillian. Yeah.
Not so much a question, it's just a comment on, I live in Peterborough, just west of Ottawa in Ontario. And in 2010, a Truth and Reconciliation support group was formed here in Peterborough. There are about 12 members. We meet once a month, and the chair is an Indigenous woman. There are 3 Indigenous communities surrounding Peterborough. And what I have learned is to listen well and to keep quiet and be humble. And to me, 2 things are important: the education and relationships. I find that when you form a relationship with an Indigenous person, it's very special, very special. They have a capacity to be open, accepting, to love. So I really appreciated this, your comments this morning, David, and it would be wonderful to meet you sometime. Maybe you could come.
Yeah, for sure. I know Peterborough pretty well, actually.
Oh, do you? Well,
I used to. Yeah, I spent a fair amount of time in Marmora, which is close to Peterborough.
Yes,
So that sounds great. Those kind of initiatives, like what you're talking about with this sort of reconciliation group, I have heard about a lot of this going on. There are, I kind of focused on some of the pushback that the church has given, but that's definitely not uniform. There are some bishops, there are some priests who are just 100% committed to reconciliation and have done just incredible stuff in like Saskatchewan. If I could only remember exactly I think it was Regina. I was reading about some of the work that's been going on there, and it's been going on for a while, not just because of recent pressures, right? Like it's been an ongoing thing. So again, there's a mix, of responses in the church.
Thank you, Lillian. It's wonderful to hear about your own work there. So
Thank
great.
you.
And Phil, you have a question.
Yes, thank you very much, David. I found your presentation to be very forthright and balanced and quite helpful. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.
I'm sitting on Vancouver Island, a long ways from Ottawa. From my front living room, I can look at Peneluk Island, where there was a residential school called Cooper Island Residential School. Some around 90 children died at the school for different causes. Some actually trying to swim away from the island. Children were brought from different reserves, different bands. So they were trying to go home. Cooper Island was not their home. So there's no doubt that that school and all schools were in the minds of the Native people, the Indigenous peoples, places of horror, and bad things happened there. And the church needs to deal with its involvement. There have been apologies. The apology from the Oblates was not just comprehensive. It went on to say that the Oblates apologized not just for what happened at the schools, but they apologized for the fact that the schools existed, that the whole purpose was wrong, right? So I think the churches still have to deal with their involvement and why they were involved in such. And if there is to be a papal apology, hopefully that apology will deal with kind of an overall statement about how the church was so off track from what church should have been, right? My concern, David, is that this focus on the church and the cry for a papal apology is distracting from the real cause. The residential schools were government policy. Unfortunately, the priests of the Catholic Church, brothers, the ministers of other churches, Presbyterian, United, Anglican, they agreed to be servants of the state. They were, in fact, Indian agents, along with others who were called Indian agents, including the RCMP. The whole project was a project of the state. And I want to just read a little a passage about the Indian Act. I'm not too sure how it is formulated in the United States, but the Indian Act defines who is considered to be status Indians. Individuals who qualify as status Indians are wards of the government, meaning that the act treats as if they were children in need of parental care. And before 1951, status Indians were not deemed to be people under the laws of Canada. They were not deemed to be people. The children in these residential schools were not people. They were property. They had numbers. And this problem of the residential schools, I think, David, my proposition is that this cannot be dealt with because the issue continues. Here in British Columbia, a nation called the Wet'suwet'en in the north are still struggling for their land rights. The hereditary chiefs are fighting to protect the land and the water and the animals. And Prime Minister Trudeau sends in the constabulary, the colonial forces, the RCMP, SWAT teams with high-powered rifles trained at women and children trying to maintain lines. So the whole project of the residential school is continuing. It is still the problem of the way the colonial government, I'm a descendant of settlers, I'm part of the problem, but it is a problem of how we are dealing with the indigenous peoples of our country. So
Yeah.
The focus on the church, I think, is a part of the problem, but the real problem continues.
I agree completely with your analysis there. I think that is a huge risk, that if we focus so much on the church's responsibility, we forget that the church was part of this, but this was a much larger thing. And it continues today, like you said. I mean, what we don't want is kind of like nice words, like platitudes. And then when it comes down to it, we still treat Indigenous people in this very highly paternalistic way, like they're sort of these second-class citizens that we have to deal with and manage somehow. And I think, I gave a land acknowledgement at the beginning of this. We in Canada now, like at every talk, you see people give a land acknowledgement at the beginning, and which is great. But then I start thinking, like, are these just words? Like, are these just things that we do to make ourselves feel better? And then things just continue like normal. And it's actually the Indigenous people who have to take action to try to, fight for their own rights without our help a lot of the time. So that's a big problem. Is this, would an apology be just words, or would it be, lead to real meaningful change? And that's a question that I think we should all think about, moving forward.
Thank you, Phil. That was fabulous, really helpful. It's as somebody who's, learning, it's really important to understand how these things came to be and so forth. So yeah, thank you very much. Donna Schroeder, you have a question.
Thank you, David. I really appreciated hearing you this morning. I'm someone who wants to learn more, and I know how invaluable it is to listen. So a document that was put out by Bishop Boland, Archbishop Boland from Regina, Saskatchewan, listening to Indigenous voices. That's been an invaluable resource, and fortunately, been able to dialogue chapter by chapter with Canadians all across Canada. And I think we all felt so uninformed, embarrassed, and appalled at what had happened. So, and also another valuable resource is 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act is another excellent resource, and I would highly recommend that. So thank you.
Oh, that's great. And I really like this emphasis on listening, like that first book that you showed was about. And I think it really fits with, this period of synodality that we're entering into, right? Like this is a perfect time to be doing this. I mean, we saw it in the with the Amazon Synod, where we had, Indigenous peoples from southern parts of the Americas coming, to Rome and sharing their experiences, their ideas, their way of doing things, and the church really took a listening stance, and I think that's the model that we can use moving forward. It's to work against that very defensive stance, which has caused so much trouble over and over again. Just put down the guards for a little bit, and it doesn't mean that everything in the church is going to fall apart if we start listening to people and actually trying to see things from other people.
Whoops. So we'll see. David appears froze. So there we go.
Did I freeze there?
You froze just for a second. It was
sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. You said that the church won't fall apart if we admit that we've done
Yeah.
something wrong. Yeah.
That
So,
if we just take the time to listen to people and freely listen to people talk freely, I think that's the important thing, without preconditions. And so I think if anything, with the abuse crisis, with the residential schools, all that stuff, it points to the idea that the church really needs to do some listening moving forward. We've done enough telling people what to do, and now it's time to hear from others, I think.
Exactly. Thank you so much. We're going to just take 2 more questions and try to keep them as succinct as possible so that we can get them both in before we go too long. So Donna, you have a question? Donna Z. You're showing up as Donna Z.
Thank you. I was going to say,
Yeah.
so it's unusually there are 2 of us. I just wanted to say that part of this is education of all the Catholics who don't understand it all. And that only comes to the personal encounter. So I have an MDiv, so that's the basis in which I speak. I did my church history 2 paper on Fra Serra and the problems that he caused here in the Americas, where he actually enabled all of the decimation of the tribes in California, which unfortunately was never heard by Pope Francis because of Archbishop Bagano, who refused to forward that information to Rome so that he would understand that canonizing him without listening to the tribes was probably the most egregious thing he possibly could have done. But importantly, Catholics and Christians have never been taught that the papal bull, the document of discovery, is the root cause of all this nonsense from the 1500s, because that document specifically calls for the conversion to Christianity of all, and here's the key word, savages. Ergo, they were deemed not to be people from the very get-go, from the very beginning of colonization. So you're actually fighting that concept from the very beginning, which is embedded, I know in the US for sure, in the foundational documents of the country, i.e. the Constitution. So that's where all this root of racism against non-white flows from. We've never been taught that. We don't acknowledge it. We don't hear it. We don't want to hear it, especially the races. But in the listening process, which I think David is key on, and it is totally the case, I spent hours doing that at the Parliament of World Religions in Toronto in 2018. The first thing you do as a sign of respect is understand how they wish to be addressed and named, and use those terms. The tribes in Canada prefer to be called First Nations. Those in the US prefer to be called the people. All of us reside on Turtle Island. That's generic across both nations. And that's important. If you don't start with those signs of respect, you're not going to get anywhere really fast. And it goes downhill. Another key thing in terms of tribal identity and understanding is that they expect to hear from Pope Francis. They could care less about subsidiarity, about the fact that the bishops have done that. They're looking for, quote, the chief of Catholicism to speak, and he has not done so. That's key. Thank you.
No, that's a very good point. The Pope Francis is the chief of Catholicism. Yeah. I think that they really do want an official apology from the top, because I think that's the only thing that would show the church is, genuinely regrets, what happened, and that the church, that there's actually potential for looking into the church's history and figuring out, where all of this started. And I think you pointed to some, like one of the primary sources there that we need to look at.
Great, thank you. So Sue Trinka, I think is you're the last one here that we're going to take a question from.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation, David. It was very inspiring. I'm in the United States. I grew up in Pennsylvania, not far from the Carlisle School. And I'm ashamed to say that I really didn't know much about that until I was well into my adult years. And And now, so this is my comment and question. I see an apology as mercy, but not as justice. Justice requires an action in my mind. And my concern about having a bishop, a cardinal, the Pope apologize is that I feel like most Catholics will say, what do you expect? He apologized. It's all over and done. But we know from the Gospels and Jesus, it's not ever over and done. It requires a change, a dramatic change in the way all of us live. So that is my concern about the apology. My suggestion would be, and I'd like to hear your comment about this, would be, wouldn't it be better if the Pope came to Canada and sat and listened? And from his listening, he will not only be moved, he will come to the realization that justice must be done. And the people who are also listening, they will know that this is going to require action, not one action, a lifetime of action. And only in that way can we call ourselves Christians, let alone Catholics.
Yeah, I think those are fantastic points. And you know, I totally agree. I mean, I think an apology has some real symbolic meaning, but again, that has to be backed up with actions. And I think, like you said, that would be my best case scenario for the papal visit, is if Pope, and I think Pope Francis is the person to do this. He's the person who is, you know, in my lifetime, the Pope that is most committed to listening. And I mean, with this, his whole push towards synodality, he's saying that's what the church has to be about right now, moving forward. And if he could come and just sit and listen to the voices of, you know, Indigenous people in Canada, the stories, and you know, just take that time to really, you know, engage one-on-one with people. I think that would be the best case scenario I can imagine. And hopefully that's what will happen. I you know, I don't want this to be something where, you know, the Pope makes an apology, then it's done, it's in the past, we can forget about it. I think this is the beginning, basically. If the Pope comes, makes an apology, sits down with Indigenous people in Canada, that's the beginning of a relationship that can now move forward into true reconciliation, I think. But it's a process, and it's not one that's gonna end anytime soon.
Thank you, Sue. And David, thank you so much. This has been incredibly informative. It's been, and I have to say, I love your humility in just recognizing your own evolution. Because if there's nobody on this call that wouldn't have to admit that we've all had to evolve in our understanding of what the gospel really means and how to separate our cultural poisons, if you will, from the real gospel message. It's really, really, really inspiring to hear you to even explain the journey in that way. So thank you all for your wonderful comments, your wonderful questions. Yeah. And I'm going to